Yeah, this only takes about 15 people. If you look at a map of Florida for the first time, it makes zero sense. But if you study it closely, you'll be shocked. All those little marks, all these things are holes in the ground. And one particular sinkhole has been stuck in my head ever since. One night in 2013, a man went to sleep at home. And by morning, he was gone, along with his house, because these holes can open up anywhere. But the most interesting part comes next. There's a real reason behind it. And this is what it comes down to. That's how Florida's sinkholes work. The problem isn't new, but over the past few decades, it's become much more severe, and it keeps getting worse year after year. Sinkholes can be quite different in size. One of the largest opened up in 2017, measuring about 249 feet across and roughly 59 feet deep. It damaged 11 homes. 2 were completely destroyed, and a third lost around 46 feet of driveway along with its septic system. Which brings up the obvious question, how does a whole house just cave in and disappear underground? Because most of the time the earth is, solid. It can hold up trucks, high-rises, roads, pretty much anything. But every now and then the ground loses its stability. It can happen naturally or because of human activity. It doesn't really matter. At some point the ground gives way, sinking a few feet and dragging down whatever was on top. Those kinds of collapses are what people call sinkholes. Actually, the fact that this is happening in Florida is no accident. Most of the state sits on carbonate rock. In simple terms, there's porous limestone under Florida, like a sponge. Water seeps through it, slowly dissolving the stone, leaving cracks and cavities behind, and over time, the soil above starts to sink down into those voids. That's how sinkholes form. And if you look at the bigger picture, almost the entire Sunshine State, from Key West in the south to the Georgia border in the north, is basically one huge limestone platform. It's saturated with groundwater. The climate's humid with frequent rains. There's plenty of water here, too much really. That same water keeps lawns green, fills pools, and supplies drinking water to millions of people. But there's a downside. It also slowly erodes the limestone under people's homes. And at some point, the ground under a foundation just isn't solid anymore. And then, wait, hold on. I'm making coffee first. Don't go anywhere. So yeah, sinkholes can pop up anywhere in Florida, but some places see them a lot more often than others. The most active zone is the west central part of the state. In central Florida, there are so many sinkholes that the region even earned a nickname, Sinkhole Alley. And it really does look like an alley. Well, if you use your imagination. Experts have long mapped out which areas are most vulnerable and which ones are considered relatively safe. The yellow zones are where wide, shallow sinkholes show up most often. They're a nuisance, but sudden collapses happen there less frequently. In the green zones, sinkholes are usually smaller. They occur more often, but they're typically not as dramatic. The blue zones are the most alarming. Sudden collapse sinkholes are common here, holes that can open up seemingly out of nowhere. The pink zones are generally calm. Sinkholes are rare there, but deep collapse pits or small cave-ins can still happen from time to time. Sinkhole Alley sits right here, where the yellow, green, and blue zones overlap. And on this map, the truly most dangerous areas are marked. The light blue dots are confirmed sinkholes. The counties of Pasco, Hernando, and Hillsborough account for 20,145 cases out of roughly 27,000 recorded statewide. In other words, nearly 75% of Florida's known sinkholes are concentrated right there. By the way, if you think this works like an earthquake, it's not even close. Sinkholes are almost impossible to predict. They can form incredibly fast and within minutes cause massive damage, serious injuries, and even deaths. The ground can look perfectly normal for a long time. No cracks, no sagging, everything seems fine. But underneath, empty cavities are slowly growing, and the moment the soil above no longer has enough support, bam, the surface collapses inward. The only way to survive is to stay hyper alert. For example, in 2013, a resort complex evacuated 35 people simply because for no obvious reason, windows in a building started cracking. Yeah. That kind of makes you think something very weird is going on. So they got everyone out. And about 40 minutes later, a sinkhole roughly 59 feet wide opened up right there. It swallowed most of one of the buildings. Basically, you can fall asleep in your own home and wake up in a pit along with the house. If you wake up at all. Let me read you the description. It's like this thing was alive. It was churning, moving around, making noises. Like a growl. Yeah, it's about a sinkhole. That's how Deputy Sheriff Douglas Duvall described it. On the evening of February 28, 2013, he responded to an emergency call in a quiet Tampa suburb and came face to face with Florida's underground world. Inside a standalone bungalow, the ground had simply collapsed. It swallowed 37-year-old Jeff Bush as he slept, taking him and his bed down with it. His brother, Jeremy, rushed in to help. He tried to pull Jeff out with his bare hands, but Jeff was already being dragged deeper and deeper. They never recovered the body. The only thing anyone could do at that point was save Jeremy himself. Duvall yanked him back from the churning pit at the last possible moment, preventing a second tragedy. Deaths like this are rare. Jeff Bush's death became the first confirmed case in Florida in decades where a person died because of a sinkhole. Jeremy later said he ran into the bedroom and saw a deep hole partly filled with loose soil, about 20 feet across. Seconds earlier, his brother had been sleeping right there. Jeremy jumped in and started feeling around for him, pushing through the dirt in the dark. The hole was about human height deep and plumbing pipes were sticking out from beneath the floor. Okay, I really don't like this story. Are there any instructions? What are you supposed to do if a sinkhole starts forming under your house? First thing, don't wait. If you act quickly, you can often prevent serious damage. In Florida, there are specialized companies you can call, pay, and they'll handle the problem professionally. One common method is compaction grouting. They pump a special cement-based mix into the ground. It expands, compacts loose soil, and basically props the foundation up from below. Another option is void filling. Underground cracks and cavities are injected with a lightweight but very dense polyurethane foam. It expands fast, fills the space, and immediately supports the soil and the house. Red flags you should address right away include potholes or sinkholes in the yard, cracks in the foundation, doors that suddenly start sticking or won't open and close properly, and concrete that's flaking. Other warning signs are a pool that's losing water, plants that wilt for no obvious reason, sloping floors or cracks in the ceiling, exposed tree roots, soft or spongy patches of lawn, and small depressions in the ground can also be clues that something isn't right beneath the surface. Basically, if we don't just brush all this off, then hold on. What about public buildings in Florida? Schools, hospitals? If you go to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection website, they ask this question directly. Is there any place in Florida that's safe to live where there's zero risk of sinkholes? I hate to break it to you, but technically no. So it turns out there aren't any completely safe places. Yes, schools, hospitals, residential neighborhoods, kids, all of it's on paper in the risk zone. But there's an important detail. For those kinds of facilities, there are engineering measures that reduce the danger. Reinforced foundations, special surveys, extra construction requirements. At least that's how it's supposed to work. On top of that, schools and hospitals are inspected regularly for all kinds of hazards, including ground stability issues. So yes, everything is at risk. It's just that those places usually get watched a little more closely than an ordinary house. And now take a wild guess who's to blame for this whole mess. Nope. When severe droughts suddenly give way to torrential rain, the ground can become unstable. It dries out, then gets soaked fast, and under those conditions, new sinkholes form much more easily. On top of that, sea levels are rising, bringing groundwater up with them, flooding existing sinkholes and making the situation even worse. Okay, but research shows something else as well. These human-triggered sinkholes occur 11 times more often in cities. In other words, in places with dense development, roads, utilities, and constant human disruption, the risk is noticeably higher than in untouched areas. Basically, it's strong evidence that people play a major role in this story. Even when the weather seems calm, the way an area is built up can raise the risk of sinkholes. Human impact plays a huge role here. Construction work and heavy equipment decide where rainwater ends up, and they often redirect it straight into the most vulnerable spots. The weight of buildings presses down on weak sections of soil, and pumping out groundwater disrupts the natural underground balance. The boundary between the soil above and the water-saturated limestone layer below. But why is it happening more often now? Like, did the Earth just decide it's had enough? In recent years, Florida has seen more sinkholes. Long dry spells are followed by intense downpours, and the ground doesn't have time to adjust. Development's getting denser, stormwater retention ponds are appearing, and water's being pumped heavily for cities and agriculture. Taken together, all of this puts the whole system under strain. At the same time, no one has nailed down an exact formula yet. The causes still aren't fully understood, but the very existence of a so-called sinkhole season suggests Florida's climate plays a major role in the story. In summer, hurricanes rolling in from the Gulf Coast make things even worse. They dump huge amounts of rain on the state in just a few hours. The soil gets heavy fast, the water drains downward, and the roofs of underground cavities simply can't take the load, so they collapse. In the dry season, it's the exact opposite. Drought lowers the groundwater level, the pressure inside water-filled voids drops, and their walls are left without support. At some point, they just cave in. And don't forget the farmers. Sudden swings in Florida's groundwater levels can also happen for a more unexpected reason: agriculture. The state's warm, humid climate and fertile soils make it ideal for farming. Along with California, Florida is one of America's true fruit states. There are citrus groves and fruit fields, many of them partly irrigated from Florida's underground aquifer. But there's a catch. Unlike California, Florida can get cold in winter. Fruit crops, especially the massive strawberry plantations, don't handle frost well. When a cold snap hits unexpectedly, farmers start spraying the fields with warm groundwater. It can save the harvest, but it comes at a cost. In a single night, the aquifer level can drop by dozens of feet. And in the past, nights like that have repeatedly ended with a surge of sinkhole collapses. So what are you even supposed to do after that? Is there any kind of insurance for sudden sinkholes? Well, it's complicated. In Florida, there isn't a state service that shows up to patch holes on private property or repair your house. If a sinkhole opens on your land, it's on the homeowner. Every year, more than 6,500 insurance claims are filed related to sinkholes. It's basically become an entire industry for lawyers, geologists, and insurance experts. From 2006 to 2010 alone, people filed nearly 25,000 claims. The total payout was around $1.4 billion. A standard homeowner's policy usually doesn't cover sinkhole damage, but under Florida law, insurers have to at least offer a separate sinkhole policy. Here's how it typically works. The insurance company sends a specialist to your property and they decide what you need, either full sinkhole coverage or just catastrophic ground collapse coverage. They test the ground with equipment like this. Catastrophic ground collapse coverage is automatically included in most homeowners' policies, but real comprehensive sinkhole protection costs extra. As of 2023, it ran roughly $2,000 to $4,000 a year depending on the insurer. And naturally, good luck selling a place like that afterward. If sinkholes have occurred on the property or nearby, the owner is legally required to disclose that to the buyer. Obviously, that scares a lot of people off right away. To make the house look even remotely appealing, sellers usually cut the price. In 2018, researchers estimated that even after repairs, homes like these sell for about 10% less on average, sometimes even more than similar homes in areas that have never had sinkhole issues. There are technologies meant to reduce the risk of collapse, special pilings, reinforced foundation supports, all that engineering, but apparently it doesn't always work. It creates a weird situation. You spend money on repairs and reinforcement just to make the house sellable at all, and then you still end up selling it for less. Not exactly a win. That said, there are investors and companies that specialize in distressed or problematic properties, so you can still sell the house. The question, as always, is the price. To be fair, I haven't found data showing people are fleeing Florida en masse, but the situation is obviously unpleasant, and it could definitely push some people toward moving somewhere more stable. Just imagine, you lose your home, move to the next street over, and then it happens again. The odds are very low, but they're not zero. And for some people, that alone is enough to start thinking about relocating to a different state, one where the ground doesn't disappear beneath your feet. But for all the dangers and downsides, there's no need to worry that Florida is suddenly going to empty out. Sure, the state has plenty of problems, like aside from sinkholes, for example, it also deals with flooding. But even so, more people are still moving in than moving out. In fact, Florida's become one of the biggest sources of newcomers to counties that face a high flood risk. In 2024, that number was lower than in 2022, which might suggest people have become a bit more sensitive to those risks. But overall, the bigger picture hasn't really changed. Earlier, I mentioned a case where 2 houses collapsed into the same sinkhole. After that, they fenced off the area and evacuated 11 neighboring homes as the temporary safety measure. In that same neighborhood, the power was cut to roughly 100 houses. The American Red Cross helped people who were suddenly left without a place to live. Today, the site is pretty telling. The hole's still there. Heavy rains have filled it in, and now it's basically a small pond. People never moved back. They had to find somewhere else to live. Well, they're not ducks after all. Right after this kind of damage, there's always an evacuation, and it's meant to be temporary What happens next depends on the specific situation. Like I said, on private property, people ultimately decide what to do. Some rebuild or put up a new house and stay. Others sell the lot at a discount and move away. Remember the house where someone died in 2013? This is what the property looks like today. Nothing has been built where the old house stood, and notice the neighboring house. Technically, it wasn't swallowed by the collapse, but it still had to be torn down. Living there turned out to be unsafe. Either way, when people leave Florida, it's not some government-run mass evacuation. Things simply don't reach that scale. So why did the authorities allow any of this in the first place? The truth is, people don't have much of a choice. Sinkholes don't ask permission, they just emerge. Just like floods or hurricanes. In situations like that, officials can't always prevent the disaster. They can only help people deal with the aftermath. Then maybe they shouldn't have allowed construction at all. The problem is, sinkholes and other karst processes don't usually make the news. People only talk about them when the ground suddenly collapses under a house or a road, and since almost all of Florida sits on karst, these processes are happening all the time, most of the time without any visible consequences. Living on karst terrain always comes with a certain level of risk, but for the vast majority of people, that risk stays abstract. They never experience a collapse firsthand, and they treat it as one of the trade-offs for life in the Sunshine State. That's why people keep building here. The chance of any specific collapse is very small, and from the government's perspective, it's easier to deal with rare damage than to cordon off a huge part of the state and ban people from living there altogether. And where would you even put the locals in that case? Because the Florida megaregion is one of the most densely populated urban areas in the United States. It's a major economic hub with a huge contribution to the country's GDP. It generates jobs, money, and growth. Its long coastline and port cities also make Florida a key center for international trade and logistics. Florida is home to numerous military bases and strategic U.S. Armed Forces facilities, which play an important role in national defense and troop training. So it'd be strange to give all of that up just because a new sinkhole might open up somewhere every couple of months. The benefits far outweigh the risks and hazards. And if the ground does give way, I guess they'll deal with it when it happens. There's one more important detail. There's no complete database of all sinkholes in Florida. Neither the government nor private companies keep one. The Florida Geological Survey has its own records, but they only include reported, officially documented cases. In other words, a sinkhole makes it into the database only if someone reports it and someone else records it. Everything else simply never shows up in the statistics. As a result, the state doesn't have a precise understanding of the problem's true scale, possibly because there are just too many cases. Not every sinkhole is even noticeable. Many are small, harmless, and don't cause any serious damage. Could this be a way of downplaying the real extent of the problem? Share your opinion in the comments. Next, let's step back and look at the overall pattern and consider whether this could repeat in other states. First, roughly 20% of the U.S. territory is considered at risk. Most sinkholes are reported in just 7 states. According to the American Geosciences Institute, those are Florida, Texas, Alabama, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. Second, there's no national plan for dealing with sinkholes. What the country does have are damage estimates. The U.S. Geological Survey says direct losses from sinkholes alone cost at least $300 million a year. And many experts think even that's an understatement. In some states, those expenses simply get lumped into overall maintenance budgets. By more generous estimates, total annual damage can easily top $1 billion. To put that in perspective, that's almost as much as the average yearly damage from tornadoes in the US. The difference is people don't really talk about sinkholes. Part of the problem is that sinkholes are scattered across time and across the map. The losses add up, but they rarely look like one major disaster. Fires and floods hit all at once in one place, and everyone can see the scale. Sinkholes are usually quiet. Their impact often stays out of sight. In a way, sinkholes across America show how infrastructure slowly breaks down. The causes vary. In some places like Texas, for example, it's linked to the collapse of old mines. Recently, scientists combined climate projections, extreme rainfall data, and soil types to create a vulnerability map. It shows where sinkholes caused by karst terrain are most likely, and if the map is right, we'll be hearing more about karst sinkholes in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana, as well as in Arkansas and Missouri. But the problem isn't limited to the U.S. Outside the country, the ground collapses too. And in some places, it's happening a lot. Honestly, way too much. Take the Middle East, for example. Rainfall is scarce there, so people increasingly pump groundwater to irrigate fields. Combine that with fragile terrain, and you get massive karst sinkholes. They've been reported in southern Turkey, as well as in Iraq, Syria, Iran, Palestine, and parts of North Africa. In early 2025, something similar happened in Japan. A truck dropped into a sinkhole right in the middle of the road. Contact with the driver was lost at the exact moment the vehicle was swallowed by soil and debris. At first, the hole was about 33 feet wide and roughly 16 feet deep. But that wasn't the end of it. It merged with another sinkhole nearby and eventually grew to nearly 4 times its original size. Overall, sinkholes have been showing up more and more often in Japanese cities. One reason is aging sewage infrastructure that simply wasn't designed for today's loads. But probably the most famous sinkhole in the world appeared in Guatemala in 2010. Have you seen those photos? Of course you have. They went crazy viral. Back then, heavy rains brought by Tropical Storm Agatha triggered the collapse of a huge cavity in the city. Photos of the crater, about 65 feet across and roughly 98 feet deep, almost perfectly round, spread around the world. I'm telling you, viral. The biggest sinkholes of this kind have been recorded in Venezuela, China, and Mexico. They exist in Italy too. Bottom line, this happens all over the world. And it looks like there'll only be more of them. The weather's getting more extreme, which means the risk of ground collapses is rising too. A good example is Turkey, the Konya Plain in central Anatolia. Before the 2000s, scientists would find one karst sinkhole there every few years, but in 2024 alone, they recorded 42. Over the same period, groundwater levels on the Konya River basin have dropped by at least 197 feet compared to 1970. Coastal regions are especially vulnerable. Storm surges, sudden swings in water levels, and suddenly you've got sinkholes everywhere. So yeah, it sounds serious, but honestly, there isn't much you can do about it. So you owe me a like. See you later.